Hello from Lahinch, County Clare on the wild west coast of Ireland. I'm Rory McKiernan, author of Hitching for Hope, and you're very welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. A huge thanks to all of you wonderful patrons who continue to chip in and support the podcast, help it grow and reach new listeners all over the world. If you're new to the podcast, please do subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. If you enjoy what you hear, check out the archives and consider chipping in, however small. It all helps over at loveandcourage.org. Your support helps create and promote powerful conversations like the one you're about to hear. And I really do love having these conversations and sharing them with listeners. I also love hearing from listeners, so do feel free to email me. You can find out the information at loveandcourage.org. And if you ever want to get in touch or connect with me around my talks, workshops or events or consultancy, campaigning, coaching, mentoring or media work, do feel free to get in touch. And before I forget, I'm going to give a quick mention here for my wonderful wife, Susan Quirk's new album. Stunning album. It's got rave reviews. It's Into the Sea and it's available now on Bandcamp, Spotify, Apple and all the various main platforms, and as a signed CD, which you can order via Bandcamp also. Look out for Into the Sea by Susan Quirk, Quirke, and you can find out more on her website, susanquirk.com, as well as her Learn to Meditate online and offline classes and workshops, all on her website. Now, back to the podcast. This episode is one that has been a long time coming, but I'm a firm believer in conversations happening at the right time. And my guest in this episode is Colm O'Gorman, someone I've known for a long time and someone I hugely admire. Colm is one of Ireland's best known activists and much more. He was born in Wexford, Ireland in 1966. He's from a farming background and spent the first 11 years of his life in the village of Adamstown before moving with his family to Wexford town in 1977. He left Wexford in 1984, living in Dublin for a few years before moving to the bright lights of London in 1986. Colm has an impressive list of jobs and careers to date. He previously worked as a waiter, a barman, a charity fundraiser, a hair salon manager, which I didn't know until recently. That's a new one. A security guard, something I've done myself in the past. A coat check attendant, I guess in nightclubs, a radio DJ, a cook, a restaurant manager, a mini cab driver, lots more. And he also then, I suppose what he says himself, before he decided to get serious about pursuing a single career, he then went on to train as a therapist, and he qualified as a physical therapist in the mid-90s and then went on to train as a psychotherapist and then went into private practice before founding the organisation 1 in 4 in 1999 to support women and men who have experienced sexual violence. In 1998, he launched a legal case against the Roman Catholic Church as a result of his experiences of sexual abuse at the hands of one of its priests when he was a teenager. Colm went on to sue the bishop of his home diocese of Ferns and the Pope. And in 2002, he took part in a BBC documentary which told the story of his battle with the Roman Catholic Church. The film was called Suing the Pope and it aired in March 2002 and resulted in the resignation of the Bishop of Ferns, Dr. Brendan Comiskey. Colm returned to live in Ireland in 2003 to found 1 in 4 Ireland, and in his role as director of 1 in 4, he was instrumental in the establishment of the Ferns Inquiry, the first state investigation into clerical abuse in Ireland. So something truly, truly monumental and historic. The inquiry investigated the management of child sexual abuse concerns and allegations by the Catholic Church and by the state authorities. In 2005, Colm went on to help establish the Gorey Educate Together National School. He played a pivotal role in that, and that's a multi-denominational, co-educational, child-centred and democratically run primary school as part of the Educate Together movement, which is thankfully continues to grow. Colm is a regular media commentator and contributor. Has written extensively on social justice and human rights issues, And he's also made a number of documentary films. I don't know where he finds the time for all of this, but you're going to hear lots more about his interesting life, which, and thankfully, one of the more impressive aspects I've found is he gets to do all these things, but he also is someone who values health, fitness and well-being and taking time out. So back to the documentary films. He was involved in the BAFTA award-winning A Family Affair in the year 2000, Suing the Pope, 2002, which I mentioned already, and Sex Crimes in the Vatican, which he presented for BBC Panorama in 2006. Colm's work as a human rights defender is driven by a deep commitment to human rights and social justice and an abiding belief in the power of advocacy and activism, which challenges all of us to use our individual and collective voices to demand change where it is most needed. So a perfect guest for the Love and Courage podcast. Colm served briefly as a member of Seanad Éireann, the Irish Senate, in the upper house of the Irish Parliament. He unsuccessfully contested the 2007 Irish general election and discovered that perhaps electoral politics was just not his thing at that time anyway. And in February 2008, Colm was appointed as Executive Director of Amnesty International Ireland, and he continues there to this day. His first book, Beyond Belief, was published by Hodder and Stodgson, and it became an instant bestseller, reaching #1 in the Irish non-fiction bestsellers list within a week of its publication. Colm now lives back in his native county Wexford with his family. And this episode, I might say, also is available as a video. So if you prefer to watch it that way, it's available as a video. It was recorded over Zoom and you can look that up. Just check out the Love and Courage podcast on YouTube or on Facebook. And do be sure to subscribe, rate, review and share and let people know about this powerful conversation that you're about to hear. So it's time to get started with the conversation. Here we go, folks. The Love and Courage podcast episode with Colm O'Gorman. Colm, thanks so much for joining me on the Love and Courage podcast. I believe you're joining me I'm guessing you're joining me from sunny Wexford. Is that right?
Well, it's been very sunny Wexford for the last couple of weeks, like most of the country. It's a little bit grey and overcast, which is frankly a bit welcome at the moment. But yeah, I'm at home in Wexford.
It's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. Obviously, like for many years, you've been based in Dublin and living in Wexford. Have you had that kind of semi-commuter lifestyle and living both the urban and rural and straddling both, or what has been that? And obviously now with the home working culture, remote working, what has been that kind of experience over the years, a straddling rural existence with the urban melee?
When we moved back to Ireland to start 1 and 4 back in 2003, we moved from London, and we were initially looking to because the office 1 and 4 office was in Dublin, so we were looking to locate in Dublin. But when we sold our house in Dublin, we couldn't replace it when we sold our house in London, we couldn't replace it in Dublin. So the circles of search just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we ended up finding a place that we loved here in North Wexford, which seemed a bit daft at the time because of the length of the commute, but for lots of reasons, particularly because of quality of life reasons, we decided to do it, and I'm delighted we did. But for 17 years then, up until March of last year, when the pandemic hit and the restrictions started, I was commuting at least 5 times a day up and down to Dublin. And there's a joy in that because, as you said, you get the urban experience and the buzz of being in the city very regularly, and at the same time where we live is gorgeous. Like I live at the foot of I look out my window here and, in front of me there's a hill covered in forest. To one side there's open fields, and behind me, 10-minute walk down a 1 kilometre laneway, there's a beach that's just a big wide open beach a couple of kilometres in length. So it's fantastic. So yeah, it was in one way the best of both worlds, but with a significant commute that for 17 years I said was fine, until I stopped doing it.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm imagining that it's being surrounded by nature and having that kind of quality of life that you speak of provided a lot of kind of counterbalance and healing, if you like, to some of the harder work that you were involved in obviously in Amnesty and 1 and 4, and just to provide a place of refuge. Was there a conscious sense of that?
Well, it wasn't part of the plan. We ended up here almost accidentally. I mean, obviously we chose to be here. So one of the reasons why we chose it was because we knew that the kids were going to come in to live with us, and we were thinking about where we wanted them to be and the kind of environment we wanted them to grow up in. So in part, once we found this place, it was about the idea of them having a more, not quite rural, but a more, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that this was a bit of a sanctuary for us as a family. And we built our house, and, you know, that was a big part of what we were creating, was a space that was ours, was a home. And yeah, that's been hugely important over the last, we're 15 years here now in the house, and we're 17 years back in Ireland. It's been a hugely important part of how I've, I suppose, minded myself and how we've minded ourselves as a family over what have been at times fairly challenging bits of work. You know, you leave Dublin, and on the commute down, the one thing I would use the commute to do was to leave work behind. So if I had calls to make, I'd do them from the car. If I had things to think through, or, you know, I'd consciously work to leave the day behind me. So by the time I pulled in the driveway and was getting out of the car, I'd transitioned from work home. And that worked very, very well.
Do you think some of your own personal journey and therapy and mental health awareness gave you the kind of skills to be conscious of that? Because a lot of people might jump in that car and turn on the current affairs drive time and all the crap follows you home. But you're obviously really working with that and minding yourself. And
I would use it to do that as well, right? I mean, I'd use it to catch up on stuff that I knew I needed to catch up on before I closed the day down.
Yeah,
that meant I could do that. But when I got home, I was home, and I'd try and, well, you know, I can't say I always succeeded in that, but generally speaking, that was the pattern. But part of that, you know, I learned some of that from my work as a therapist. You know, when I was working as a psychotherapist, you need to have almost rituals, and frankly, you develop rituals that allow you to leave the work behind. I always remember talking to a supervisor once who told me about how, you know, what she used to do on her way home was she'd go through the clients that she'd met with and worked with that day. And she'd use the commute home. She'd have the windows of the car open, and she'd be driving home, thinking about and processing through, you know, each of the people that she'd met with and where she'd left them. And when she'd finished with each one, she'd imagine streamers flying out the window, letting them go, knowing that she'd pick them up again when she came back. So she had a very conscious routine or ritual that she used. And that really stuck with me. So when I was working clinically, I did many of the same things. You know, I always, when I got home, I would, you know, change my clothes. So I got out of my work clothes, regardless of whether or not they needed to be work clothes, and you know, had clothes that I wore at home. And it wasn't about cleansing. It's not about that. It was about the ritual of changing, of stepping out of one space and into another. So I learned the value of that as a therapist, and then it just stayed with me in the work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hugely valuable, particularly in the realm of activism. You know, that we're burning the bright fire, and ultimately, for me, the road is long, and to go the distance requires something to underpin and hold you on the long road, or else you end up in the ditch more often than not. So, you know, to have that investment, but also, like, you know, people will know you as many things and as an activist and all sorts, but you know, you're also very strongly a family man, which is an important part of it. I don't know if it's an important part of your identity, but it is very much who you are. Like, you're a loving family man.
Well, I mean, it's at the core of my life, right? Or of what matters to me most. I mean, I feel very lucky to have had the life that I've lived and to have been able to do the work that I've done. But I suppose the thing that I feel most blessed by are the relationships that I have in my life.
Yeah,
you know, it's family, it's those connections, it's friends, it's those kinds of intimate, deep human connections that I think are the most important parts of my life. Anyway, you know, I always felt that, you know, whenever my head is touching the pillow in the last moment, those are the things I'll be most grateful for, and they are now the things I'm most grateful for. Now, you know, all of that sounds wonderful, doesn't it, Rory? It sounds like I've managed all of this perfectly, and I drive home every day and step out of work, and you know. That's not the reality, of course. I mean, because when you do the kind of work, if you're involved in activism or work in the public sphere, and particularly, you know, in the digital era, you don't just get to leave it behind, because you'll be getting calls from journalists because something will break online, or because something happens that demands immediate attention because you need to respond to some nonsense or something that's spilling out in the online sphere, and you have to step into it. But even with all of that, the thing that I would have tried to do was still to have those moments where I would transition or leave it behind. It didn't always work. I certainly didn't always get it right. I mean, I can remember, at the end of 2018 in particular, heading towards the end of 2018 in particular, coming to a realization as I began to emerge from it of just how burnt out I was. And that was probably, so I certainly haven't always managed that brilliantly. But I think I've been lucky enough, even when it got to that place of having a moment where I could recognize it and then do something about it, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily get to do.
Yeah, often the realization arrives perhaps a little bit too late to turn back the direction.
Yeah.
And it's particularly difficult, I'd imagine, being in a leadership role in that sense as well, because there's a certain degree of vulnerability that's required. Like on the one hand, I guess it comes down to the definition of strength in that, are we allowed to wear our vulnerability at the same time and say, look, I'm actually really in a bad place, or I need some time, or whatever it is, which is quite frankly, a lot of people's day-to-day resistance. People are often just holding on, and we all go through those bumps.
Yeah, and I think also, it's to understand the extent and the nature of your own resilience, but also not to exploit it. So I'm very lucky. I'm a very, very resilient person. But I also know that at points in my life, I've relied on that or almost taken it for granted. And there's a limit to everything. And also, just because one is resilient doesn't mean that one should be. There comes a time when what's not okay is not okay, and where we have to be able to say, this just isn't on. Nobody should, just because I might be able to cope with a level of attack or vitriol or anything else, doesn't mean it's okay. And it also doesn't mean that, it doesn't have an impact beyond me, to people, on people that I love and people that I'm close to. So, there's been a lot that I'm unpicking at the moment, frankly, in many ways now, and understanding, maybe in particular about the last kind of 6 years or so, maybe especially, and about the impacts of some of that stuff. Yeah, and about what it means to be resilient, to be vulnerable, to know the limits of where one should go and the degree to which one should depend upon one's resilience. There's a lot that I'm still unpicking in all of that, I think.
So do you find yourself in a more reflective space in your life right now?
I think we probably all are. I think I was heading in that direction very much anyway. But I think, the one thing, one of the many things that the last year and a half has done is it's caused many of us to, I think, reflect upon, it certainly has for me, to reflect on how we're living and how we're managing our lives. Because we've had to step out of the normal, and also because we've had to learn how to do things in ways that we wouldn't have imagined we could do them before. Up until March of last year, there were so many things that we said, it'd be great if, but of course we can't because we don't have the systems or the means or the ways of working or the ways of relating that will allow us to do certain things. I mean, a good example of that would be, Amnesty International at a global level, saying we now need to transition to less meetings in person. And let's start looking at doing more of our big global democratic decision-making, maybe in the online space. Could we look at using virtual platforms for meetings, that kind of stuff? Yes, absolutely, we should do that, particularly for reasons of climate impact and environmental sustainability, but even from a cost perspective. And in fact, so we need to be looking at that. And then, COVID hit and we had to do it. And we found out we could do it. Yeah. And similarly with, remote working, after 17 years of driving up and down to Dublin at least 5 times a week and doing, 35, 40,000 miles a year in a car or 60,000 kilometers in a car, I have weeks where I barely get in my car and go anywhere. And it's entirely possible and it's very practical. And we can do good work and do it in this way and manage our lives in different ways. So, I think those kinds of having to do things differently has also caused us to think about the way in which we might continue to do things differently or make even bigger changes. And questions around quality of life and around the value of work or the value of where are we putting our energy. And if we can limit wasting energy, wasting our own energy as a resource, as well as obviously thinking about all of this from a wider environmental perspective, there are ways we can work better, fitter, in a kinder way, in a more balanced way. So yeah, I absolutely more reflective generally. Maybe as well, I've also gotten to an age. I mean, I was 55 about a week or so ago. You know, I'm at an interesting point in life where I'm not so much reflecting backwards, but when I think forwards now, I'm thinking in a different way. You know, I'm thinking about what am I going to do now, and not what am I going to do, but what do I want my life to be?
Yeah, for
the next couple of decades. And it's, you know, the kids are growing up. We're in a different space in many ways. So there's more opportunity to kind of create the kind of future, or you know, to reimagine the kind of future that's different to the routine or to the demands of the last sort of 20 years or so.
And do you feel that food and cooking has a lot to do with this? I'm sure you're getting asked this left, right, and centre. For those that don't know, your public presence in the world of culinary delights, and now a columnist with the Irish Examiner on food. And I saw a headline the other day, "What is Colm O'Gorman eating?" or something like that. I was like,
that is mad, isn't it, Rory?
What are you eating, Colm?
That's just been a lovely thing that's happened. You know, when the lockdown hit for the first time, I was thinking, as thankfully lots of other people were, what are the things we can put out in the world now that are going to hold us, and how are we going to hold each other in this? You know, particularly when there's such distance. What are the things that we can create that will give us something to look forward to each day? So I, as is often the case with me, tweeted something, had an idea and immediately put it into a tweet. And it was that I would write a new recipe every day of the lockdown, just to put something out there and to encourage people to connect in. And I, you know, like many of us, I thought that might be for, you know, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. And about 110 recipes later, it was still going on. And it just had a fantastic response and people were really into it. But actually, it was also just a really important focus for me during that first lockdown in particular. So, you know, it was both a wonderful distraction from what was happening in the world and from the work, because when your life gets shrunk into a screen, you know, the means to which we're talking now, it becomes a very narrow space to inhabit. And for me, it was very important to try and build moments where my view or my engagement with the world was taken up out of that space. So I would work each day and then I'd go for a run with the dogs. And while I was running, I'd think about what I was going to cook. And then I'd cook, and as a family, we'd have whatever I cooked. And then I'd very quickly put those recipes out online, and there was kind of another engagement with people. So it was just a lovely thing. And yeah, even as a cook or as a food writer, you know, I developed a lot over that time, and that ended up to me doing the thing with the Examiner, which I love. I mean, it's just a lovely creative output to have, but also I think food and the experience of food just connects us on such a profound level as human beings. It's just one of those that's a bit lofty way of putting it, but it's just one of those lovely, ordinary imperatives, right? We all have to eat.
Yeah, I don't see it as lofty at all, Colm. Like, I mean, I think particularly traditional cultures and probably cultures not that long ago when we were growing up knew the value of food as a community building. And like, if we don't build community, what are we? Do we sit and literally break bread together? So it makes perfect sense to me, but it's also very... is very life affirming and joy enhancing, the fact that you're doing that, and you can still fight, you know, human rights abuses at the same time. They don't have to be separate things, because I think one of the things that often happens in activism and advocacy is become addicted to the misery, and all you can see is the misery, and that is there, but also the beauty is always there as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the one thing that has always, I wouldn't say sustained, but has always grounded me in the work is the absolute confidence in the goodness that lies at the heart of humanity. And it continues to be my experience that if we create space for that to emerge, it will inevitably. It's like life seeks to fulfill itself. And that doesn't mean that it destroys itself. It means that it moves towards health and thriving and self-actualization in all of its forms, whether it's a seed grown out of a crack in a wall, or whether it's a human being recovering from trauma, or a human being, being able to live in the world in a joyful, life-affirming kind of way. I think that's at the heart of life, or at the heart of humanity, is that desire to manifest in a healthy, powerful way. And no matter how bad the circumstances, it has always been my experience that if we create the conditions for that to manifest, it will, and it does. So that's the thing that's always sustained me in the work. Yes, all the darkness is there, but what's in and around and underneath all of that is all of the light and all of the goodness and all of the love and all of the courage and all of the humanity waiting to manifest, waiting to give an opportunity to move past that. It doesn't deny it, but it will wrap itself around it, heal it, and move forward. And that's never been my experience. And where we don't succeed, and of course we haven't succeeded, and we continue not to succeed in lots and lots of spaces. In my view, it's because we haven't yet created the conditions for love to manifest. So for me, really good activism, really powerful, impactful activism is about creating opportunities for humanity to be its very best and for love to manifest. And when we do that, we always succeed. Always.
Yeah, it very much, for me, echoes the Martin Luther King's concept of the beloved community, that if we're not building something that's based on love, then what is it? It's just another tyranny. Yeah.
Or it's unresolved ego, or it's the need for territory or for space or for validation or for something else. And we all have that, right? We all have ego. We all need validation. Yeah. We all need to be acknowledged and recognized. And all of that's grand, but if in its own way, but if that's not grounded in an understanding of the overall impact that we're trying to have, if that's not what drives the work, then, we're unlikely to succeed.
Do you mind if I ask you how you navigate ego yourself? Because, being in the public space, and then whether it be newspapers or media or heading an organization, and then people just knowing your name, like quite often it becomes the person is either chosen to or is put front and center. And implicit in that is like you can become over-identified with yourself, and it becomes hard to separate yourself from the work. I'm not suggesting that about you. I'm just saying that is often the case. And unless there's an incredible degree of self-awareness, one can get lost. And I'm just wondering, perhaps your own psychotherapy training, or how have you kind of traveled that particular road, or have you a sense of it?
It's varying degrees of success at various points. I think. I think that the truth is that that's never what fundamentally drove me. Like, my route into activism or into doing this work was absolutely about responding to information. So, or facts, right? I can explain this better, I think, if I just speak to what it was. So when I came back to Ireland in early 1995 to report that I'd been raped and assaulted by a Catholic priest, I thought I was coming back to report what one bad man had done to me when I was in my early teens. And I'd done some work in my head to understand that I needed to place this somewhere, and the place I needed to give it obviously was the state, because they were responsible for doing something about it. So I'll report it to the guards, and I did that with the support of family. But within about 6 months, I discovered that the church had known about this man abusing children before he was ordained a priest, but it ordained him anyway. Within 18 months, I found out that the Vatican had known, they'd been made aware of concerns about this priest, but he had remained in ministry for a very long time, and he was only stepped aside from ministry when he was arrested on foot of the complaint that I made. And after that complaint, a number of other people came forward as well. But what happened to me when I heard each piece of information to me led to another question. So how could that be allowed to happen? So who's going to ask that question? So I had this expectation, naively as it turned out, that as soon as it became clear that the church that knew about this, somebody would go, okay, well, there's an accountability question here. Somebody needs to go after that and ask questions. And it became really clear that nobody was going to very quickly. And I couldn't accept that. So it was it was just obviously profoundly wrong. And it was deeply concerning that that was both possible, but also that there was no interest on the part of the state or any authority in addressing any of that. And that was unacceptable to me. I don't mean from because it happened to me. It was just unacceptable to me that that level of injustice could be tolerated and that that level of violation could happen and that nobody said, we have to step in here. Mm-hmm. So my natural response to that was to say, well, right, we have to do something about that then. So that's why I decided I'd sue the church and sue the Pope. And that's where that came from. So my route into that work was grounded in what I think was a very natural, normal response to hearing shocking information and to recognizing that something needed to be done about it, but wasn't, and therefore we had to do something. So I stepped up to do it. So that's where it came from. And I was about to say I was lucky in that way, but that in and of itself meant that it wasn't about, the ego piece didn't come into those decisions. Quite the opposite, actually, because there was a lot of pressure not to do it, both from within, because it was a difficult thing to talk about, but also from family and from other spaces who really, nobody wanted to talk about this stuff then. Nobody wanted to open all of this up. It was a big journey to me to move from a place of deep, deep self-loathing and shame because of the things that had happened to me, to then be able to say, no, I'm going to take this on, I'm going to name something about it. So I went on a journey that meant that this was absolutely not about ego. But of course, then when you're lionized for doing that work and you're held up as a hero or as this or as that, then ego, of course, can creep into it. But I think I was grounded in purpose above all else. And obviously I have an ego and we all like attention and we all like validation. But I don't think it never took over to the point where I lost sight of purpose or what it was that I was trying to achieve through any particular piece of work that I did. And then the other piece is, because of the clinical training that I had, I became very used to working with people's projections and people's fantasies about who I was as a therapist. But then when you step into that public space, people have all kinds of ideas about who you are. But I knew that none of them were true. People might have an idea about well, when I say I knew that none of them are true, I knew that many of the fantasies that people have about other people are their own projections, right? They're not real. So people may know something of me because of the work that I've done or because I have a capacity to communicate some truth. But there are lots of things that people will imagine about me that aren't true. And there's lots of aspects of me that people won't know or don't know. So I never took all of that seriously enough for it to actually really feed my ego, because I always knew that was only a fraction of the truth of who I was, for good or for bad. And that helped a lot. And I was surrounded by good people, both in my family and in my own life, but also in the people that by the people that I've worked with over the years.
It's everything, isn't it, to stay grounded and stay connected. You mentioned there you mentioned shame and self-loathing. And I wonder then, that big question of why doesn't somebody react? Why doesn't somebody act? I'm curious about that, what might be a sense of national shame and national self-loathing and how that has played a role in debilitating action or preventing action, or is it more insidious? Is it more about structural power, or both? Even now, so many years later, we're still playing this out around mother and baby homes and so many things still being covered up. And we have this kind of image that we're making progress, and we are, but at the same time, there's too many echoes of the same story at play.
We've made massive progress. So I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that. Yeah. And I'm incredibly proud of what we've done. And the we, I mean in the broadest possible sense. Yeah. One thing that I've observed time and time again is that the if we want to understand who we are as a people, we have to look to us, the people, for a good definition of that. We can't look to those who comment or observe us, even if they are of us. And also we shouldn't look to our leaders, because our leaders half the time, our supposed leaders half the time, are trying to present something that they think they need to present in order to appeal to us so that they can be successful in their bid to be our leaders, right? The political piece. So there's very often a very deep disconnect between who we are and what we think, and how official Ireland imagines or presents how we think. I mean, really good examples of that over the last decade have been both the marriage equality and the referendum on the Eighth Amendment, where, you know, official Ireland said these would be really close, these would be really divisive, these would be awful debates. And in part, at times they were, because of how those debates were framed and held in the media and public sphere. Whereas actually at the level of the everyday and the ordinary, there were very different conversations happening. People were way ahead of where politics or media imagined they were, because we'd been on a journey. You know, those referendums, I think, were a reflection of, or a moment where we both threw off shame and oppression and made really powerful statements about who we are as a people and how we want to be as a people. Now, we need to do an awful lot more of that, but I think those were real, huge, enormous, significant statements, significant manifestations of who we are. So if you think about both of those referendums, and on marriage equality, for instance, you know, of course, yeah, the question was, should we allow two people of the same gender to marry? But actually, the big question we're being asked was, do we believe that the loving relationships that we form with each other are the foundations upon which we build our lives, our families, our communities, our society, our republic, if we want to take it to that legal and political sphere? And if we believe that, do we believe that that should be something to celebrate, to hold dear, to protect? And if so, do we think that should be available to everybody on an equal basis? And we said yes. And for me, what was significant about that was not the fact that we decided we'd let two men or two women or two people of the same gender to marry, but rather that we committed to that notion that those relationships are core, those bonds of love and kinship that we develop with each other are core to who we are in the world, are core to us building our lives, our families, our community, our society, and our republic, that we want to celebrate that and that we want to hold and nurture that for everybody equally. It was a profound moment. And it wasn't. I remember being on Morning Ireland when the count was happening, and within half an hour it was being declared as a win for the yes side, and you know David Quinn and the no side were conceding. And I remember one of the presenters saying to me, "Is this a sign of Ireland embracing of a new Ireland, of an Ireland that's embracing modernity?" And I went, "No, it's not. This vote was not about embracing something outside of ourselves. It was about reaching back into a deep and frankly ancient understanding of who we are. It's not new. It's not difference. It's not abandonment. It's not an embracing of something new. It's a manifestation of something deep and true and profound about who we are." And for me, the eighth was exactly the same. You know, the decision in the eighth was, the question then was, at moments of crisis or of tragedy, or of crisis or of need, how do we want to respond to that? Do we want to pretend it's not happening? Do we want to judge and blame and dismiss and brutalize? Do we want to expel and alienate and exile? Or do we want to wrap our arms around and support and love and nurture and care for each other? And we said, yeah, we do. So those were massive moments. And those were things that we were told we were not capable of understanding or getting to grips with. I can remember in the early 2000s, a then senior government minister saying to me, in Ireland, we're pathologically incapable of having an objective conversation about abortion. We were not. Our systems of public discourse were so controlled, were so rigid, were so unthinking, were so lacking in courage and compassion, that was the reality that was created. I mean, if you look at the eighth, if you look at the exit poll from the eighth, we found out that the majority of people knew how they were going to vote long before the referendum was held. In fact, well over 70% of people hadn't changed their mind on this issue in more than 5 years. So as far back as, 2013, a referendum to repeal the eighth would have passed.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to do things differently, but we weren't either being provided with, nor were we able to articulate the demand for an opportunity to make that clear. And I think those referendums became moments through which we threw off shame and control and oppression. They were absolutely a reaction to the shame and the oppression of the past. They were outraged rejections of the past, and I think determinate statements about the kind of future that we wanted to create. The challenge is, how do we keep having those conversations? Because we have to have them in other places. If we're going to talk about racism, about in particular, how it manifests in this country through anti-traveller discrimination and bigotry. If we want to talk about classism, classism is the one big conversation that we still haven't found a way to have in this country yet. Well, when I say we still haven't, it's the one conversation that hasn't been. It's happening, I think, actually, interestingly. I think it's happening in those other spheres where meaningful public conversation happens outside of media now, I think. But those are some of the big conversations that we need to have. I think we'll have them. I think if people keep, and I mean, one of the things that I feel very hopeful about are the number of people in the world now, out in Ireland, in our society, who are pushing these conversations, who are not going to be silent, who are demanding that we pay attention to these issues. Those are the things that make me confident that we'll keep going. But yeah, we've a long way to go, but we've come a very, very long way. I don't think there's any putting that genie back in the bottle now.
Amen. I'm just thinking back to your to when you were younger, Colm, and I remember watching the Channel 4 series "It's a Sin" about the AIDS epidemic, and I remember you tweeting about it. And it just occurred to me that you were probably in London, if not Dublin, around that time, and I suppose it does speak to how times change, but it also, for me, was an important moment of reflection and consideration as to those that have suffered under regimes and under prejudice. And what was it like for you, kind of watching that show and and thinking about? I know that's a big question, but
I waited a long time to watch it, and then I only watched it in the end because I was going to have to talk about it. I was asked to take part in a public conversation about it, so I know I had resisted watching it because it was a. I mean, first of all, I think the show was extraordinary, and I think it managed to capture both the joy and the beauty and the magnificence of the time, and then the terrible tragedy of it too. But the power, what came from within community at that time as well was in its own way extraordinary. So it was phenomenal. If anybody who's listening hasn't watched it yet, go and watch it quickly. But I came out in 1984. I found the gay community in Dublin in kind of late spring 1984, so I was 17, not quite 18 yet, and it was around the time that the AIDS crisis was just emerging. I mean, at that point, HIV was known as HLTV3. I think it hadn't been named the HIV virus at that stage, and it was being seen as this gay disease, as this gay cancer, and talked about in those terms. But I do remember the very small community, this incredible community in Dublin, which frankly saved my life in many ways, because I was in a very lost place before I found them, and found a sense of self and a space of safety to begin to understand who I was in the world. They began to respond to that crisis. So that's where, we first started hearing conversations around sexual health and how to protect oneself against the virus and that kind of stuff. And then I went to London in February of 1986, and things had developed on quite a lot, and now we were seeing the scale of the crisis, and so many people were being diagnosed and were dying. And we buried an awful lot of people. I mean, by the time I was in my mid-20s, we'd lost a lot of people. We'd buried a lot of people. By the time I was 30, we'd buried a huge number of people. And it was awful. It was awful. I was convinced that I wouldn't live to 30. I remember when I was, 19, 20, being in London, just being absolutely convinced, because it was inevitable. It seemed absolutely inevitable. We were all going to get this virus, regardless, and we would die. And nobody cared, really. The state had little interest. And when it did, it was only to say that this is death. There didn't seem to be any energy or any desire to protect or to people from this disease or to fight this disease. And in particular, those who were vulnerable to it were seen as, morally suspect or having lesser moral value than ordinary people, than good people. I'm watching the show. There's a scene in the show where, in the shared house, one of the people living in the shared house takes a mug that they know has been drunk from by somebody that they think could be HIV positive, and they end up smashing it. And I can remember having one of the temporary little jobs I had in Dublin at one point before I moved to London, was working in a hair salon in Coolock. And it was myself and another guy who was working there who were both gay and out. And I remember the staff with management's agreement, it being absolutely cleared that they would not, we would have to drink from different mugs, and those mugs would be kept separate from everybody else's. So, you had both the stigma of the disease layered on top of all of the stigma that surrounded being gay. I mean, this was at a time when homosexuality was still illegal in Ireland. That only changed, in 1993. And then the disease layered on top of all of that. It was awful. It was awful. And I was utterly convinced that I would not live past 30. This was absolutely inevitable.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's one of the things that's so frustrating about watching the response to the pandemic now, because, of course, we saw massive breakthroughs in medicine and in treatment and therapeutics. We don't have a cure for HIV, but it's now a condition that's no longer life-limiting, really. It's now a chronic condition through which, with medication, people live fully healthy lives. We know we can absolutely prevent transmission of the virus. That somebody who's HIV positive, who has been given effective treatment, the viral load can be made undetectable, which means it's untransmittable. But also there are medications available, there are therapeutics available that means that you can't catch the virus, even if the virus can't take hold, even if you come into contact with it. But, a lot of those medications just have not been available to the people who need the most. I mean, in the 1990s, for instance, HIV therapeutics were costing, I think it was $10,000 a year. And an Indian pharma magnate decided that he would start to produce them off patent because there were 21 million people who needed them who couldn't get them. So by pushing to take them off patent over a number of years, they finally forced the pharma companies who owned the patents to suspend the patents to allow for their production for use in the global south. As soon as that happened, those drugs became available for $1 a day, and tens of millions of people got access to them for the first time. Yet here we are now in the face of a global pandemic that's impacting us all. We're facing into we haven't learned that lesson. Ownership of intellectual property is limiting the production of vaccines, so that people in middle and poor income countries, particularly in poorer countries in the global south, will not have access to vaccines until probably well into 2024, if that. Because we're protecting the interests of pharmaceutical companies, who, by the way, received hundreds of billions of public money to produce these vaccines. So we haven't learned that lesson either, which is frustrating, as we look back. I digressed wildly away from the original question. Which is
well, yes, but it's very much perhaps one of the human rights issues of our time. This is a defining moment for who we are as a people in Ireland and globally. Are we prepared to put up the borders of our own humanity and but the I wouldn't say the beauty, but within the complexity of all this is the interconnectedness that this pandemic will never be over until it's over for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, that mantra of none of us are safe unless all of us were safe emerged very quickly in the pandemic. I can remember we were using it around direct provision centres here in Ireland I can remember recording a video on the last day in the office back in March of 2019, making that point in relation to the failure of the state to put in place proper protective measures for people in direct provision. And that's become an accepted mantra now, that for all of us to be safe everywhere, everybody has to be safe. None of us are safe unless all of us are safe. And it's true at the global level. And we're seeing that with the emergence of variants in particular, and concerns around new variants. it is a moment where our interdependence is completely clear, where, from a public health perspective, that's something that we have to recognize. And of course, it's also a human rights imperative. I mean, for me, it demonstrates the really practical argument for a rights-based approach. And I mean, it's one of the things that really concerns me about the constant focus on charity as a model to respond to a public health emergency. This notion that this system called COVAX, through which rich countries will donate vaccinations to the global south, that's the solution. Mm-hmm. Charity is not the solution. A charity-based approach, I mean, it's both from a public health perspective, appalling. From a human rights perspective, it's absolutely galling. But, the idea that somehow we can accept a situation where so many countries in the global north, ourselves included, will have access to vaccines, multiples more than we need. Whilst in the global south, countries are struggling to vaccinate tiny percentages of the population. I mean, right now, the big challenge across Europe is to move past the limits that they've hit because of significant amounts of vaccine hesitancy in some countries. Whilst at the same time, countries in the global south can't even access vaccines at all. And the pharmaceutical companies, and more importantly, the states that are propping up that system of intellectual property protection above all else, are opposing measures within the World Trade Organization designed expressly for emergency situations like this, that would allow the sharing of technology, the temporary suspension of intellectual property rights, to allow these vaccines to be produced where they need to be produced so that we can vaccinate everybody quickly. And underneath all of that, I mean, the levels of institutionalized discrimination, xenophobia, and racism that underpin it all. I mean, when you hear those who defend this approach saying, well, those countries wouldn't have the capacity to produce vaccines. What? Like, what? India is the largest vaccine producer in the world.
Mm-hmm. And is exporting them in the middle. There's a kind of echoes of the Irish.
Yeah. Well, India stopped exporting, which the AstraZeneca vaccine, because it was producing it at the Serum Institute, but it stopped producing it, which was a big alarm bells ringing for countries here, because they wanted to be able to access AstraZeneca vaccines coming from India. But the idea that we can't build manufacturing facilities, transfer technology, and that there aren't skilled engineers and biomedical scientists in the global south is utter nonsense. I mean, for God's sake, who are BioNTech? They were Turkish refugees and to Germany, and the people behind that company. Just the sheer patronizing, stigmatizing, racist narrative that underpins that approach. These people couldn't do that. You couldn't just do that there. I mean, within a period of 6 months, there was a factory in Germany that was purchased by a major pharma company that had produced cancer medications up until that point. In a period of 6 months, they turned it around, trained everybody up, reconfigured the systems, and it was producing millions of doses of vaccine for Pfizer BioNTech. That was in Germany. Within 6 months, they turned it around. There are many facilities and plants around the world and in the global south that could be used in that way, or indeed we could build them. We could build an infrastructure now that would allow for the production at a regional level of these medications where they're most needed. But we're not doing it because we're protecting the interests of pharma companies. There were 9 new COVID billionaires minted last year, 9.
Well, they say that COVID is the great revealer. And I think, there's this notion that colonialism was somehow parked or ended in the 60s and 70s. But you can see now that so much of it is still at play. And then when it comes down to economic inequality, it's very much at play. So it's certainly a time of reckoning, isn't it? And part of that, Colm, I just want to touch on it, is very much at the fore of Amnesty's work at the moment is obviously technology and the development of technology, but also the sinister development or the sinister use of technology for abuses such as particularly the Pegasus spyware that's very much a live issue at the moment, and how ultimately, we knew this many years ago from Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and others, that our phones are listening devices and recording devices. But now we have 110% proof if ever we needed it. And, you know, it strikes me that this is another defining issue. Like, it's time to grapple this. Snowden told us many years ago, the world didn't act. Are we going to act now because Macron and several members of his cabinet have been spied upon, and we don't know if the Irish cabinet or whatever, but, you know, I don't know. It just feels like a crossroads for humanity, and a very historical crossroads, whether it be vaccines, technology, ecology, the whole gambit.
The danger of this moment is that for those powerful individuals whose security has been compromised by this, solutions will be found. So the danger is that they will be protected and the rest of us won't be. And of course, the people that we should be most concerned about in all of this are human rights defenders, grassroots activists, ordinary people who are being targeted by authoritarian regimes around the world. I mean, Hungary, for instance, is one of the companies that's been identified as a purchaser of this software. Mm-hmm. Nearly every one of the countries that have purchased this or where this software has taken hold are under the control of an authoritarian regime. And as always, the only way this is going to change is if the demand for change becomes irresistible. It won't change if we leave it to governments to decide whether or not they'll act on this. It'll change when ordinary people demand that we do something about this. I mean, if you look back to the whole arms control debate or discussion, for a very long time, major powers were very happy for there to be lots of grey areas within which arms were traded. And lots of people made an awful lot of money. And, you know, the arms industry did very well indeed, thank you. And lots of people who operated in the middle ground also made an awful lot of money. And that was fine because it worked to serve the strategic interests, the so-called strategic interests of certain powerful countries and actors and players. But then they recognized that actually with the threat that posed to peace and stability generally became unbearable for those countries, because it began now to attack those countries. And finally, they decided to do something about it. I mean, the reality is that until a few years ago, there was no global treaty that controlled the trade in arms. There was more international law around the trade in bananas than in bullets until a few years ago. And it took 20 years of campaigning on the part of Amnesty and some other NGO partners that we had to secure the Global Arms Trade Treaty. And we're still working to try to make sure that's applied properly. So I wouldn't be enormously confident at this stage that at the political level or at the systems level, there's an appreciation that there needs to be a non-proliferation approach to this kind of technology and to its misuse as well. But yeah, it's a huge issue. And, you know, the authoritarian right is very much on the rise across the world. Look at Europe. You know, Europe's a country that where regionally we have some of the strongest human rights protections, enforceable human rights protections through the courts of anywhere in the world. And yet those protections are not working. We see what's happening to marginalized communities and to activists and human rights defenders in Hungary, in Poland, in other countries. Yeah, it's a big wake-up call. This is a really significant moment. And the research on Pegasus that Amnesty and others have done over the last little while is critically important there. And again, you know, these actors can only exist and can only operate in the world if they are permitted to do so by states. And very often they exist within, or they're an offshoot of a particular state and how it manifests in the world. In this case, you know, NSO obviously is very closely allied with Israel. It's an Israeli company. It's grown out of that infrastructure in Israel as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a great time from that perspective for sure.
No, well, I mean, it probably merits mentioning, you know, the fact that, you know, even Israel's reaction to it was to shut down debate, shut down inquiry, and to go into defense mode and to attest that they were going to respond aggressively and to have no shame in the use of the word aggressive just weeks after the blitz of Gaza, you know, one of many blitzes of Gaza. So Again, I emphasize that for the danger with so many atrocities is that there becomes perhaps overwhelm and fatigue that Gaza and Israel drift from our consciousness. And again, I think the plight of the Palestinian people remains one of the bigger causes, or the more urgent causes.
I do have some hope there, right? And when I say some hope, I mean there is a chink. If you look at discourse, for instance, now in the United States, it's started to turn. Yeah. It's moving. There's finally, and I mean, at nowhere near the level that there should be, but there's finally more openness to understanding and to recognizing the appalling plight of the Palestinian people, and to challenging Israel's. I mean, Israel's position on Palestine is so blatant, it's so clear. Mm-hmm. I've sat across from representatives of the Israeli government and from Israeli ambassadors who said stuff like, we attach a different moral value to a Palestinian life lost in a reprisal for a rocket attack on Israel than we do to the life of an Israeli lost because of that rocket attack. Civilian lives, they attach a different moral value to a Palestinian civilian life.
They have unashamedly used the term mowing the lawn.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Or where, when we've challenged them on the collective punishment of, 1.5 million people in Gaza, they'll nod and say conditions in Gaza are very difficult and that's how they will remain if that's what was required to keep Israel safe. So, I mean, collective punishment is a grave violation of international human rights law. Israel has committed countless war crimes in Gaza. There has been no accountability for that. None. Now, equally, not equally. On the other side, of course, and it's frustrating that there's almost a demand that this be acknowledged. On the other side, there are bad guys too. It is, of course, not acceptable that armed Palestinian groups target civilian populations in Israel. Of course it's not. But equally, we're never going to get anywhere if nobody is. We have to focus in on people's individual action and hold them accountable for their individual action. So the whataboutery that arises around all of these debates is one of the big problems. And the fact that people have been so ready to buy into this notion that to challenge Israel is to be anti-Semitic. I find that galling on so many levels. Never mind the fact that it somehow suggests that central to faith is the way in which Israel conducts itself. I haven't come across, and the Jewish faith is as noble a faith as any other faith I've come across, and I'm not a religious person. I haven't come across a single principle that of any of the Judeo-Christian faiths that would support the way that Israel is conducting itself and how it's treating the Palestinian people. And to me, to conflate, for Israel as a state, to conflate Judaism and faith with the atrocities and the violations that it's perpetrating on the Israeli people is just extraordinary. But I think people are finally seeing through it now. Finally.
I think so. And it also ignores the fact that there's incredible breaking the silence and many other Israeli and Jewish groups that are very vocal and very much leading resistant Jewish voice for peace in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, then again, we still need, and again, that's where I think Ireland can really step up. I mean, I just wish the government would finally get behind and support the Occupied Territories Bill. There are things that we can do here in this place that will have a profound impact.
Absolutely. I've been along, and obviously you're coming from the Sean McBride tradition in Amnesty's HQ in Dublin, and Amnesty's founding figures. The fact that Ireland can be a human rights leader globally, and I feel like in recent decades we've lost that sense of ourselves somehow.
I think we do it in certain spaces, right? And I think, again, to look for the encouraging sign, it has been interesting to see how Ireland has become a champion, for instance, of LGBT rights globally now, coming out of the marriage equality referendum.
Yeah. Even the US embassy, the Irish embassy in Washington, their Twitter account, it's amazing to behold.
But I mean, Panty has been flown around the world. Sorry, I'll do that in a different way because it sounds glib. Panty Bliss has been brought to screenings staged by Irish missions overseas of Queen of Ireland, of that film, which is a very queer film. Like, it's unashamedly so, thankfully, and really powerfully. Ireland's position on LGBTQ rights is bold and unapologetic and courageous. It's fantastic. But the reason why it's so is because of the position that we as a people adopted in 2015. More of that, please. Let's make sure that we as people recognize that when we powerfully manifest who we are, when we commit to those values, then there's a much better chance that government will. So on Palestine, I mean, there's always been a passionate community of human rights champions and activists here in Ireland who've been incredibly engaged on the occupied territories and on Israel's conduct there. We need to find ways for more people maybe to get behind that, right? Because politically the will is there. I mean, the Oireachtas would have passed that bill if it wasn't for government simply not allowing it go through. That would be a huge moment. That would be a really significant moment. And then equally, I mean, Ireland's on the UN Security Council now as well. I mean, to give Ireland credit, I mean, the work that Ireland is doing, for instance, on the Syrian conflict, those in other spaces, I think Ireland has both a good track record of being a champion in international fora for human rights, and of doing really, really good work. So there's a lot that we can be proud of, but there's an awful lot that we could do better. And there's still quite a lot that we need to bring home,
Yeah. Well said. I know you get asked this a lot, Colm, but, where are you at in terms of your own prospect for politics or return to politics? Is that something, or is that boat sailed, or could it sail again, or?
I don't think I've been asked that in a few years, actually, thankfully. It usually happens. Yeah. I suppose around that time of year, usually as soon as silly season hits, I get a call from a journalist, usually about the presidency or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't have any ambitions at all to get involved in politics right now, anyway. And I'm not saying right now anyway as a way of leaving the door open for the future. I just mean I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah. But you're not saying no either. And I'm not trying to smoke you out on this. I'm just genuinely curious.
But I'm not trying to be cute and avoid being smoked out.
No, I mean, look, I could see.
I don't. Well, I'll be blunt about it. I, for instance, would never see myself running for the presidency. I don't see that happening.
Yeah. I mean, look, I can see you opening a fantastic community-orientated cooking food emporium, or leading the charge as a TD for Wexford. I mean, there's many possibilities in a young 55-year-old's life here.
Meanwhile,
you have a job to do as well. I'm not forgetting that.
Yeah, or I could see myself quite happily running on the beach every day with the dog and cooking for my family, and maybe writing every now and again and doing very little else. So, I mean, who knows what the future holds. The other thing is, the wonderful thing, the really, really wonderful thing about where we are right now is there are no shortage of brilliant leaders in this country. Yeah. There are no shortage of extraordinary activists who have insights that are way beyond the kind of insights that I have. The reality is that at some stage in life, it's really important that one recognizes when I'm not saying when one's work is done, but when one recognizes the limitations of one's own insights.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I mean, I said a little while ago that I think one of the really important conversations we need to have in Ireland right now is on class, on ethnicity, on traveller discrimination, on ableism and disability. Those aren't issues that I can personally speak to at a huge level of insight. I can speak to what it means, what it can be like to be discriminated against, but I can't speak to those issues.
Yeah.
And I think there are brilliant activists of all ages who have really important, compelling things to say, and we have to make space for those voices to emerge and to take center stage. I think the work of people like me now needs to be about making sure that happens. I think on things like racism, which I really think we need to talk about more in this country, there's an awful lot of listening that some of us have to do. And then I think we have to get very, very active but I think we need to, some listening, and then there's actually a lot of really important reflection that we need to do. One of the things that worries me, one of the things that I struggle with sometimes is that I think we're very often a little bit too dependent upon people who have been the victims of our shortcomings as a society to help us become better people. And I'd love to get to a stage where that wasn't so necessary anymore. I mean, I remember making a speech at, I think it was the Safe Ireland Summit a couple of years ago, where I said I'm really, really fed up with being told that I'm courageous or bold for speaking about experience of sexual violence. Of course, it takes a level of courage to do that, but that's not really a reflection of courageous individuals. Rather, it's a reflection of a cowardly society, because these things do not happen utterly beneath the radar. It's not true that everybody always knows, but as we know, if we look at Ireland's history of these kinds of violations, be they what happened to people within a church context, in their families, in their communities, or particularly institutions, it's not true that everybody in the country knew about what was happening in industrial schools and mother and baby homes. That's not true. The dogs in the street did not know. People knew these weren't great places to be, but everybody did not know what was happening in them. But what's absolutely true is that very deep veins of knowledge ran right through society at all levels, and that there was a collective silence and silencing of that experience until those who experienced violation would no longer be silent, or until we began to speak in a way that meant that sufficient people started to listen, and then things began to turn. But that's not a reflection just of courageous individuals. It's a reflection of a cowardly society.
Yeah.
And I suppose if I have an ambition around many of these issues, is that we would become collectively more courageous, and that we would listen and understand where something requires attention, and then do the work ourselves to understand what we need to do to create change. We cannot keep depending upon the people who we have traumatized and violated and failed to help us become better versions of ourselves. Mm-hmm. We have to commit to doing that, and to doing that work doggedly ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think the conversation around racism and what it means to be anti-racist is a really, really important conversation that's going to demand that of an awful lot of us.
Yeah, I agree. And I fully feel that given the culture of institutionalization, that direct provision has to be front and center in that mix. And I sadly envisage a day when there will be tribunals or inquiries with children that were brought up in direct provision centres, where we'll be hearing their testimonies. I
think that's entirely likely. Yeah. I think
we can't say we didn't know either, because we know plenty.
Yeah, we know plenty. I mean, I am so glad that finally there is, I think, a very solid commitment to ending that system. I really believe in the bona fides of the commitment that's been made. I think that we'll succeed there. I think it'll finally happen, but it'll happen 20 years too late. I mean, this was a temporary measure that was put in place, 21 years ago?
21 years, yeah. So I think thinking back on our conversation here, Colm, there has been so much achieved, and there always is. It's that dance of. Actually, I was before you came on, I was going to say the dance of light and dark, but I just have a load of books on my desk beside me. I'm doing some study in psychotherapy myself, actually. And this one here says, what does it say? Hope beyond despair in the tagline. And
it's also person-centered therapy, which was the model that I studied. So Rogerian and person-centered therapy was the
there you go. Yeah, it's funny how the book just jumped out of me the minute, just as you were about to come on screen here. And but hope beyond despair, it felt that it was speaking to me as we began this conversation. But it feels like it's speaking to me as we close the conversation too. That we carry that hope in our hearts, and carry that bold vision, and that beloved community, and that sense of love and justice and courage. And I suppose that's the nature of this podcast, is the Love and Courage podcast, that we march forward with that together.
Well, what else is there? And I don't mean in terms of, without that, well, we have to reach for that, because if we don't, I actually mean, what else is there? I mean, at the heart of what it means to be human, I absolutely believe, nothing in my life's experiences has disavowed me of this view. At the heart of what it means to be human is a desire to live a life of love, and of, if we talk about a purpose, well, what does purpose mean? In my view, purpose means to love, oneself and the other. That's the way in which we self-actualize. That's the way in which we manifest at our, when I say our best, I don't mean our most valuable. I don't mean our most acceptable. I mean at our best. It's the way in which we manifest the truth of who we are most successfully. So there is nothing else. There is nothing else but love. And, that for me, it doesn't just mean that there is always hope. It means that we have that to anchor ourselves in, right? If we can be confident in that understanding, then everything flows from that. Then every possibility exists. Because if we create the right conditions for it to manifest, it will. And then suddenly everything becomes possible.
Beautiful. Thank you, Colm. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for all the work that you've done over many, many years on behalf of so many people. It's hugely appreciated by me and by so many. And hopefully you're going to get a well-deserved break this summer if you haven't had one already. And keep up the cooking as well. I
will do. Don't worry. At some point, I'll have to cook for you properly.
Oh, I'd love a feed. I'm always up for a feed. Thanks, Colm.
Thanks, Rory.
Hello, Rory McKiernan here again. Before you go, I want to ask if you might consider sharing this episode with family, with friends, anyone you think may be interested. I want to make sure as many people as possible get to hear Colm's voice and his story, his inspirational story. And to watch, you can also watch the video version, as I said earlier, on Facebook and on YouTube. And a huge thanks to Colm for being part of the podcast. Please also consider shipping in to become a podcast patron over at loveandcourage.org. You can check out the archive of great conversations and subscribe, rate, review wherever and however you can. And thank you once again for listening and for all your support. Here's to seizing the moment. Here's to making a stand, to shining a light for love and courage in the world. Until next time, thanks again.